Welcome everyone to this curious conversation with myself and Professor Richard Boyatzis. I can't tell all of you how excited I am to be interviewing Richard. He's one of the people that's had such a significant impact on my thinking around not only coaching, but many other things. So I want to welcome distinguished professor at Case Western University, Professor Richard Boyatzis, one of the world's leading experts in leadership development, emotional intelligence, coaching, neuroscience, behavioral change. I'm going to keep the introduction brief because it could take up the 40 minutes we have just to go through all of your achievements and accomplishments, Richard. So,
and it would make me too tired to be able to do the webinar. So thank you.
And Richard, I just want to say before we get into this, that one of the things I really admire about you, in addition to everything you've contributed to the fields we talked about, leadership, emotional intelligence, coaching, is your way of being, Richard. You're so generous, easy to talk to, supportive, encouraging, empowering. And it's something that, I really wanted people in our network to experience as well. So Richard, first of all, thank you so much for your time and generosity in talking to us.
You're welcome, and thank you. We've had a few engaging conversations, and I'm looking forward to another one.
Oh, thank you so much. You're right. Every conversation, I leave energized and enthusiastic. What we've said to our network is that we're going to talk particularly about intentional change theory, because when it comes to theories about change in relation to coaching, I think intentional change theory is the most directly applicable to coaching. And one of the books that I recommend to everyone is Helping People Change. Again, fantastic book, not only about coaching, but about change. So could you start off by just talking to us a little bit about what made you think that this theory was needed?
In 1966, I was finishing my junior year at MIT. That's the US-based MIT, not the one in Australia, the Royal Melbourne Institute. And my major was, and what I graduated with my degree in aeronautics and astronautics. I specialized in control systems of interplanetary vehicles. I'd wanted to be in the space program since I was 9. My parents were immigrants from Greece, and as a result, and my father kind of came over just before he could officially be drafted into the U.S. Army, and then landed on Normandy Beach and went through France and Germany with the Allies and all the rest of it. But what the moral of that story was that by the time I was born, and really for almost his entire life, my father was a waiter. So they didn't have money to help me with, but they helped me in so many other ways. So I was able to get into MIT through the work of a number of key teachers of mine who helped me, and a whole bunch of teachers actually who didn't. I mean, I had in my first 4 grades, the New York City public school system tried to lead me back 3 times because they thought I was cognitively slow. So, there are a lot of those kinds of struggles. But anyway, so I went out, but I ran out of money at MIT. I mean, I'd used all the money I'd saved from working my music jobs and working in restaurants as busboys and all that kind of stuff. And all the loans and scholarships I could get, and I was just tapped out. So MIT had a thing where they could get you a job doing the kind of research and science, aerospace science and engineering, rocket science, that we were trained for. And companies loved to do it because then they figured out they had an edge on hiring us. So for 6 months, a little over 6 months, I worked in the Experimental Gas Dynamics Research Unit at Northrop NorAir in California. Worked on a couple of reentry vehicles and space planes. This is 1966, so this is before we were doing much of that, but and some other things. It was very clear when I was doing it that it was really boring. It was not I mean, I wasn't an astronaut, and the Air Force had made it clear to me that I couldn't be an astronaut because of my eyes, and in those days you had to have perfect natural vision. So I was doing this stuff, and we'd work in our cubicles using computers to, play out different kind of things. And I just thought that there's no way I want to live my life like that. So I went back to MIT and I only had 2 courses left to finish. I did them. But I started looking at what else am I going to do? I didn't want to go in the restaurant business. Every male in my extended family on the US side of the Atlantic, Greek men, were all in the restaurant business. I didn't want to do that. Although I loved my music, I didn't think I really had it in me to really make it big. So, and I dabbled with maybe being a Greek priest for a while, and then I finally settled on, you know what? I'm going to be a manager. It's got to be easy. Look at these idiots we had at Northrop. I mean, I was a part of 2 departments in the research unit that were full of, if you get the TV show Big Bang Theory, Sheldons. These are a lot of people who were smart, really super smart, scary smart. And we had a manager of each department, and I couldn't believe how little they got out of people. I mean, we basically did as little as we could to get by, and it was uninspiring. So I went to sign up for some management courses before I finished MIT. I figured at least I'd go into management. And one was a young guy who was finishing his PhD, actually hadn't completed it yet, David Kolb, who went on to create experiential learning theory and all those tests. And he described his course, and it sounded in this, kind of buffet that didn't have prerequisites. And his course sounded absolutely bullshit to me. It was organizational psychology. I couldn't believe how silly it sounded. But he said 2 words that made me run to the basement and try to get into his class, which I did, was able to, because everything was oversubscribed. The 2 words were no tests. I mean, the entire course of my life shifted dramatically because it turns out I'm very test phobic. I don't do well on tests, and I've always suffered from that, although I didn't know it till years later in training to be a therapist. Anyway, Dave Kolb, I wanted to do my term paper on how managers didn't help their subordinates. And he said, I just finished collecting data over 2 years on how our version of MBAs at Sloan School, they're called Sloan Fellows, and how they help or don't help each other. It's real data. Would you be interested in working on, 28 to 30-year-olds instead of managers? I said, sure. I dove into it, busted my rear. He liked what I came up with. He offered me a job for the summer. And by the fall, he got me into PhD seminars with people who at the time sounded intriguing, but I didn't know who they were. Ed Schein. He became one of my personal mentors. I did a number of doctoral seminars with him. David McClellan, who did become my thesis advisor and close personal friend. Carl Swanson, who was with Jay Forrester in the System Dynamics group. So I was studying with these legends, but I didn't know that at the time because I was new to the field. And within months, they basically loved the idea that I was working on with Dave Kolb. So this work, intentional change theory, started in the spring of 1967. Wow. And it started with us saying, how do people help each other change their behavior? We ended up calling the theory that Dave and I developed self-directed behavior change for a long time. But they also convinced me to go to graduate school. I didn't think of it. And then they convinced me to go for a PhD. And then they convinced me to go in psychology, not management. So there were another set of teachers who were pivotal in my growth and development. And to this day, for those that are still alive, I had a great conversation with Ed Schein a month ago, and he's 93 and has produced 4 books in the last 5 years. I said, Ed, you're my new role model, 93 and still being creative. Anyway, so it started with this notion of how do you help people do better?
Yeah.
I then, because I was really interested in how you help people change. In my doctoral program at Harvard, which was a multidisciplinary program, you had to finish all your stuff in clinical experimental psych, personality, social psych, sociology, and cultural anthropology. So, and I ended up gravitating towards learning a lot about doing psychotherapy, and I became a psychotherapist as well as studying personality. And that was where, because I ended up being interested in the psychotherapy as a great way to see if you could help people change and research, I ended up, when I graduated with my PhD, turning down Richard Hackman, who offered me a job at Yale for my first faculty position, because it wasn't quite the job I wanted. Decades later, he's sitting in my office in Boston, and after he had moved up to Harvard, and he said, you know, that was the smartest move you ever made, although I had no idea why. It allowed me to focus, because I spent most of the 70s doing work on competencies, which I had begun in 1970, creating the whole field of competency-based
Yes.
Research. And at the same time, working on this issue of working with alcoholics and drug addicts and training therapists, doing therapy. I mean, I was averaging 17, 18 days of group therapy a month. And meanwhile, trying to figure out how can we help them in addition to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, in addition to medical treatment. And that created a lot of the basis for what I continued to do thereafter. I mean, it helped me refine many of the parts of what later, around the year 2000, I shifted the name to intentional change theory.
Yes.
But that's how it all evolved, which is how do you help people? By 1979, money was drying up in the substance abuse field. It's very depressing when you spend that much time doing psychotherapy. There are many fields where the recidivism rate is, I mean, we were able to move the dial on the recidivism, but still, most people who develop those kinds of biochemical addictions end up dying, killing themselves, or unfortunately killing someone else in the process. So it's very sad. So by 1977, 8, I said, I have to shift. And that's when I decided to shift to leadership and management, because I wanted a multidisciplinary phenomena. I wanted something that I could bring all of my stuff to bear, the psychophysiological, the behavioral, all that stuff. And I wanted something that was so crucial that people were willing to pay for the research. I was tired of spending days writing proposals and negotiating, you know, for $15,000. And that's when that shift happened. And meanwhile, we've been continuing the competency work. So in a funny way, the competency work started out as an odd question, because I was interested in how you help people change. Well, if people are dysfunctional, alcoholics, drug addicts, you know, one of the major areas you want them to change. I mean, they have to get sober, they have to stay clean, but then they have to re-enter their families or create new ones. They have to be functioning citizens. The what is clear. What happens when you're dealing with quote unquote normal people?
Wow.
And that's when we said, okay, you should be helping them develop the things that make them outstanding. And that's how we created, and McCullen had worked on this idea of competencies as a, not, you know, bigger than skills, rooted in some unconscious thing back in the late 50s, but never did anything. So I did the first empirical study in 1970 and then continued doing some of the studies through the 70s, but it became very clear that we were starting to see patterns. And I and my company was given the big contract from the American Management Association to create a new MBA, one that was based on competencies, not knowledge. So you get the knowledge in their MBA, but you develop the ability to be an effective manager and leader. That research that spanned the 70s came out in my 1982 book, which is a research book on what does it take to be effective. So by then it became very clear a number of things. One, people needed to have some ideal that they were striving for, because if they didn't, they weren't going to change. You know, just because you told somebody, you know, your attitude isn't good, you know, they put their fingers in their ears and, you know, and maybe make a gross gesture at you. So, and then the issue is a lot of people needed different grounding in who they were, the real self.
Yeah.
And it wasn't what you thought of yourself, because even then, it was very suspicious. I mean, Ed Hollander showed among leadership research that people were lousy at understanding and being able to describe their own behavior. And he started talking about it and showing the research in the late 50s. And by the time I knew Ed in the late 60s, early 70s, he was, moving on to other things. But today still, it's one of the reasons why self-assessment, I think, is so useless in most research. It's useful in coaching because it's the model a person has of themselves, but it has very little to do with the reality of how most people act. And when you're doing research, you're trying to figure out how other people experience you.
Yes.
So all of that competency work later morphed to what we now call emotional and social intelligence. But it gave us a pretty good grounding. And then what became clear in the theory is that, now let me jump ahead to the late 90s and the year 2000. It became very clear you needed complexity theory to understand how people change. Because my desire was always to understand sustained desired change.
Yes.
Sustained. It has to last more than 3 months.
Yes.
Desired. It has to be something that's wanted. And the change has to be some morphing. I started using an early version of complexity theory called catastrophe theory in the 70s to explain how you could help alcoholics and people with alcohol problems not get into arguments, not get into fights. But the reality was, having trained in the aerospace area, I was very used to nonlinear dynamics, and that's what we're talking about. And even to this day, I mean, I'm trying to finish a chapter right now that says almost everybody who does practical work with humans or tries to create systems and manage them assumes that human behavior is normally distributed. The data does not support that at all. It's almost all distributed by a power curve, which is very different. Anyway, so by using complexity theory, it became clear when I started putting together the results of these different longitudinal studies, ones I did in the 70s, ones I was doing in the late 70s and early 80s, that there were 5 moments in which people had a breakthrough if they did. The reason most people don't change, and most of the money in training and development is wasted, most of the money in education is wasted. I don't have any data on this because there's so little data that says coaching works. I suspect, given the other fields, from psychotherapy to teaching to whatever, that chances are most of the money spent in coaching isn't very well spent. I mean, people may change, but Isink's study from the 60s showed in the National Health System in the UK that people who went through 1 year of psychotherapy changed as much as the people who were on the waiting list. So the reason that most people don't change is you don't have this series. It's a cycle of awareness, and you keep going around it, iteration. So one is, what kind of person do you want to be? What do you want out of life?
Yes.
What's your deep sense of purpose? What's your calling? A personal vision. And that, to be good, has to be very compelling and very comprehensive. That's why we ask about people's physical health and romantic health and spiritual health, everything. It's not just work. Work is a small part. And then, if you have some dream, you're eligible to find out how you're coming across to others. If the output of the first discovery in intentional change theory is a vision statement, the output of the second is a personal balance sheet. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? The third discovery, if you're ready for it, is what do you want to do to get closer to your vision? Not people who design a process to make up for your weaknesses have lost the game already. They aren't going to change. It's like people who say, I'm going to lose weight. You're not going to lose weight. You've defined it negatively. We now have the neurological data to show you're closing down already. But if people want to get closer to their vision, their dream state, and use their strengths, maybe work on a weakness, they put together a learning plan. But the learning plan is not a performance improvement plan. It's the opposite of that. It's something you're joyfully looking forward to.
Wow.
The fourth stage is where you experiment and practice with the new thoughts, feelings, behaviors. And the fifth stage, which actually isn't the fifth, is the forming of these resonant, caring relationships that enable you to go through the others. Now, that's where coaching, I thought, originally started in terms of my research. I was trying to say, okay, tell me about this fifth discovery. And Kolb and I even, by the time I'd finished my PhD in 1973, we'd published a number of studies on what those helping relationships look like.
Yeah.
I was also doing formal coaching. I started in 1969 as a part of leadership programs, which, there were a lot of people doing research on coaching and doing a lot of coaching under that label in the 60s and 70s. Anyway, what became clear as we started in the last 30 years of really focusing on the dyadic relationships, because my intentional change theory is a fractal at all levels. I think it's identical, the process for change in dyads, couples, pair relationships, changes in teams, changes in organizations, changes in communities, changes in countries, and even global phenomena.
Yeah.
So part of it is there are important things that move information up and down these different levels. And working with a lot of different doctoral students and colleagues, I have a series of studies at these various different levels. But coaching ended up becoming a great focal point because unlike the 60s and 70s, I wasn't having to argue the purpose and explain why it wasn't really psychotherapy. People had started to accept it. And there was not any good research on it. And actually, now there are a handful, maybe a dozen outcome studies, but that's given the amount of money and effort spent on coaching, it's horrible. And that's when we also started, I decided I had to go back to the physiological. So I started doing some of the neuroimaging studies, as well as supervising, I should say, a number of doctoral students doing the hormonal studies. And that really opened the door for us because it helped us to understand what I call the tipping points. What helps a person move from one of these discoveries to the next? And that's where, as you know, I came up with this notion of the positive and negative emotional attractor, which is part hormonal, part neurological networks, and part emotion. But it becomes very clear that if you invoke the positive emotional attractor, a person opens up mentally and emotionally. If you invoke the negative emotional attractor, they close down. The problem is specific goals and a problem focus invokes the negative emotional attractor because you psychologically try to prove that you can get there or you are put on the defensive. So some of the things that we purport to have as a part of coaching certification actually don't help. They do the opposite. So it became very clear that in the process of helping pursue sustained desired change, we could help a lot by helping the helpers. So given my early work started on helping, it was a kind of flip back to it. And I worked a lot with teachers in primary and secondary schools and headmasters and headmistresses in the 70s. It was a good way to pave my way through my PhD program. But then later I worked in hospitals. So I was working with physicians and nurses and therapists. And whenever you work with different groups of helpers, you find a very similar pattern. I've now published a few studies with former doctoral students of mine on one on Catholic pastor priests and clerics. And that really, as you so graciously noted, our book is called Helping People Change because we focused on coaching, but we also focused on education for teachers, on managers and leaders, on physicians, nurses, clerics, therapists, parents. In all those cases, we want to help. And the key you start to appreciate when you look at the mechanism, as well as the longitudinal studies we've done, is that most of the time in our sense of urgency and expediency, we push the wrong buttons. We do what Melvin Smith and I started calling in 2003, coaching for compliance. I'm going to coach you to be a better team player because I want you to be a better team player. Did I ask you if you wanted to be? No. Or I asked it in such a way you had to say yes. So the dilemma is we started contrasting coaching to the positive emotional attractor, and we called it coaching with compassion in the Confucian sense of opening yourself up to the other person, bringing them forward, versus coaching for compliance in which it's my agenda for you. And I've even done studies because I work in, I'm on the boards and work in a number of different of the large hospital systems in the US, and I do a lot of teaching in them, that one of the things that accounts for why treatment adherence is so low, why so people do so little of what their physicians or nurses tell them to do after surgery or for rehab or after an illness, is that most physicians and nurses tell them what they should do or else you'll die, or else we'll have to amputate your feet, or else. And all of that, you know, what is the person receiving here? What they hear, what they feel is they're now in the presence of a helping bully. Even though you mean well, and parents do this all the time, even though you mean well, by loading the person on with what they have to do to fix themselves, you're automatically putting them on the defensive.
Yes.
And we now have a number of studies showing that if you flip it, if you make sure the context for the helping, and in this case coaching, is their dream, not their goals, their dream, their sense of purpose, the big picture, all of a sudden people open up and you release this amazing amount of energy. Sorry, I went way longer than you wanted, but I get excited about these things. Let me stop here.
I love the excitement, and I feel really privileged to hear the story. It's such a rich story of how you came to this, and it's obvious there's a deep, in terms of your purpose as well, of, you know, helping people to change. And I've just heard also helping the helpers
Yes.
by supporting them. And so we really appreciate that. And thinking in an educational context now, and in a school context, it does jump out at me at how relevant the idea of sustained desired change is. So if you think about the situation we're in right now and schools, what sort of ideas do you have about?
Well, yeah, no, I think this is right. Look, there are very few roles in society where you have huge leverage effect, where you can start things that ripple and cause other people to start things.
Yes.
Being an educator is one of those rare roles. It has even more profound impact than being a physician or a nurse, because if you spark curiosity, interest in your students, your learners, your staff, they go on to do it. So first, there's the observation that educational systems are multi-level.
Yeah.
As you know, you've heard me say before, colleagues have done a number of these studies in a number of countries that if teachers show more emotional intelligence and build better relationships, more resonant relationships with their students, the students do better. There's less truancy, there's more completion, they get more A levels in the UK studies, they have higher GPA in the US, all these different things.
Yes.
We also know from other studies that folks have done, including I was involved in one in the 70s and one of my doctoral students in the 90s, that when principals of schools, elementary or secondary, or headmasters and headmistresses, as they're called in other parts of the world, when they demonstrate more emotional and social intelligence and build better resonant relationships, the teachers do better. There's higher engagement scores on the teachers. There's better climate scores. The teachers choose to stay. There are all sorts of things that happen. And we also have seen when the superintendent of a school system uses more emotional and social intelligence and builds more resonant relationships, the headmasters and headmistresses do better. So when you start with that, what you're appreciating is something that we now know neurologically, which is that as humans, we communicate brain to brain. And the evidence suggests that you infect the other person with your emotional state in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second.
Wow.
And Joseph Ledoux found this work. And that means that it's deeply unconscious. And it doesn't matter what you think you're showing, it's what you're really feeling. So this is called emotional contagion. When you're in a helping role or in a managerial role, like a headmaster or headmistress, you have a little higher infectious rate because you're in an authority position and people look up to you. They might look up because they're suspicious, but in Australia, for example, they usually, because you have a more egalitarian society, they'd look up because they respect you. In the US, we're just suspicious. But the fact is, that means that you're more contagious.
Wow.
And I remember in the early 70s working with Dave McClellan on this. One of the things that professional helpers have is a lot more what he called power stress, because we feel the responsibility of our role.
Mm.
So here we are in a high leverage position where in any level of administration or direct teaching, you're having this huge percolation and cascading effect on each other, and of course to the students and to their families. And our internal state is driving the most profound issue. So the biggest issue that we started to see, I know in the US, after decades of trying to help public education, we discovered that the most impact was when you did school-based management. When you treated each school, an elementary school or a middle school or a high school, as its own ship.
Yes.
And you put the person in the headmaster or headmistress role who was a really good leader, an effective leader, magic happened.
Wow.
And it didn't matter whether you pumped more money or not into the system.
Yeah.
That the real returns occur from the emotional excitement and the motivating effect.
Yes.
Now, to translate it into my topic, so what I'm saying is when we work with helpers, especially in education, we have to first say, where are you, teacher, headmaster, headmistress, superintendent? Where are you? Are you excited about life? Are you excited about your future and your dreams? Are you dancing to the music of life? Because if you're not, you're infecting everybody else around you with this downer message.
Yeah. Wow.
And in this day and age of budgets, of political turmoil, you know, in the United States, if parents speak up against the official school board, our Department of Justice and FBI has decided to label them terrorists because it went against the political rhetoric of the particular school boards. So, I mean, the problems are huge. On top of the financial burdens of any school system, on top of the financial burdens of the people in these roles, because we're not always paid that much, on top of the fact that we're in a pandemic.
Yes, yes.
So you look at all this stuff, and then in our various countries, we have some social and political disruptions that are quite extreme.
Yes.
And fortunately, in your country, you're not suffering the huge increase in murder and assaults that we are. I mean, it's just horrible, absolutely horrible. I mean, my son lives in New York City, and he's a PR executive at NASDAQ and takes the subway. And my wife and I were worried because this weekend, 3 people were stabbed on the subways.
Oh, no.
You know, horrible stuff. Anyway,
yeah.
You add all that together. No wonder we're stressed.
Yeah, yeah.
But if that's the state that we're in when we walk into our school building, if that's the state we're in when we walk into our classroom, if that's the state we're in when we walk into a teachers meeting or faculty meeting, what we're doing is infecting everybody with that fear and defensiveness. And nobody's going to be innovative. So my first primary target right now are the people who are in the helper roles. We have to tend to ourselves. We have to feel renewed and um, the way to deal with stress is not to try to lower stress. Dan Goldman and I have been working on this for about 7 years. We developed a test. We published it last year that looks at the moments of renewal versus the moments of stress that you had in the last week. And we're not looking at big events. We're looking at normal events. Did somebody cut you off in traffic versus did you have a good laughing moment with your family at dinner?
Yeah.
And those differences are rooted in the physiological, sympathetic versus parasympathetic activation. And that's a key part, one of the dimensions of my PEA NEA. So what we're really saying is people who try to become more engaged in life by lowering their stress are fighting a losing battle. All you're doing is going to have mild stress. It's still stress. And stress is emotionally and cognitively and perceptually impairing.
Yeah.
So the antidote is to have more of these PEA moments, these literal parasympathetic moments, where you actually engage the opposite to stress. And that fits in because it turns out that that's the same thing we've been saying for 20 years we should be doing as coaches or helpers with our clients, our students, our colleagues, which is to engage them in more moments. Now, you can't do that all the time. I mean, if you could be in this parasympathetic state all the time, you'd be levitating. And while some people may be able to do that, I don't think that's a lifestyle. So right now, I think education, this is going to sound odd, but the first issue is not to tend to your students. The first issue is to tend to yourself.
Wow.
Because if you don't do that, well, it's a futile job of what you're doing with your students. If you do it well, if you're on this point where you're able to mix in enough things during the day, during the week in which you're feeling excited, in which you're feeling refreshed, and what are those things? Meditation, yoga, prayer, modest exercise, feeling hopeful about the future, which is why you shouldn't watch the news on TV, being in a loving relationship, helping others less fortunate, helping the elderly. So I tell my students, helping your elderly professors will get you closer to heaven. Having dogs or cats, and in some places horses or monkeys, but it's pets that you stroke, has been shown to really be powerful. And then in the last few years, enough studies have been published in the neuroscience and medical area that I feel confident saying for anybody, male, female, different cultures, different races, walk in nature and being playful, laughing, being joyful really work. So I think but it all starts with your sense of purpose and vision. Then you say, okay, if I'm starting to rebuild that for me, and therefore in my family, now when I walk into my office, school, classroom, I actually have a running shot at being able to stimulate curiosity and hope and caring and compassion in the other people. So that's where I think the role of coaching and the process of coaching is exactly what we do in education.
Absolutely. Richard, it's everything you're talking about, I'm experiencing, which is really wonderful. I'm a bit more buoyed up. I'm more optimistic. And, that the idea of our emotional contagion, it's so helpful because, as you know, within the education sector, we've got so many people who are so committed to helping others that they sometimes lose sight of or feel guilty even of looking after ourselves. And so your message today, it's so resonant and I think so important, this idea of taking care of ourselves so that we can empower others, we can bring positive contagion to others. So
my wife was a kindergarten teacher, taught 5-year-olds for a number of decades.
Yes.
And when colleagues of hers who were also elementary school teachers would come over for dinners or evenings or whatever, one of the things that struck me early in our marriage and getting to know these folks was how almost none of them had children.
Oh, okay.
And it turned out, I don't know in Australia, but certainly in the United States, that's often true. Elementary school teachers don't have kids
Wow.
because they're students or they're children.
Okay.
But I do think that's a part of giving their all in the classroom and then not having enough left at home.
Yeah.
And that's a mistake. That's a mistake.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's really been inspiring stuff. And the way you've managed to take a theory, you know, intentional change theory, which is central to coaching, but really bring it to life for us, Richard. I'm incredibly grateful to you because it just, it feels like the time to think in the way you're talking is now, you know, with everything that's going on that you talked about. So thank you so much. I want to just circle back, and I really appreciate your time, so I'll keep it brief.
Right.
I want to circle back to you saying that you had some really great teachers and educators in your own life. Are you okay to just reflect on one or two of those educators and the impact they had on you, Richard?
I started doing an exercise in 1999 at a big conference I was doing in Firenze, in which I asked the question, who helped you the most in your life? Okay. I then later started doing research on it. And as you know, it's an exercise in all of our books and now in our MOOCs and other things. And besides my mother and my father, let me talk about the teacher, of all the teachers who helped me in various ways, one that jumps out is Max Boyson. Max Boyson taught physics in my high school. I took the first year of physics in my junior year. He offered a small group of us a chance to have a second year of physics. And this is before the AP system got really big. But in fact, in most universities, if we took the test at the end of our senior year, we could have placed out of the first course in physics. I couldn't because at MIT, they decided everybody has to learn it the MIT way, but it was a college course in physics. And Max Boyson was amazing. There were six of us, I think, in this course. I mean, we were in a public school system that was it was a working class community, but because it had the county hospital, county jail, county reformatory, half of an Air Force base, we had a lot of tax money. So we had great teachers, really great teachers. This is one of the suburbs of New York City. And Mr. Boyson said to us at the beginning of the year, we're not going to use a textbook. We're going to study the experiments that created the field of physics. We'll do experiments that Galileo did, that Newton did, and Niels Bohr, and all these other things, the ones that we could get the equipment to be able to do. Yeah. And that sounded like a lot of fun. And he said, we will study physics through those fundamental experiments. The first one was to look at Newton's determining of the big G, which was the gravitational constant, and to look at how he really started to solidify the nature of gravity. So he spent a few days, we read up on the studies and read up on what Newton did and why, and it only needed a few pieces of equipment, which he had already bought for us. And we're in this basement room in the high school because there wasn't a regular classroom available. So over the summer, we volunteered to clean up this basement, repainted it and all that. So we're in this basement room, and we spend about 2 weeks doing all these measurements. Yeah. And at the end of the 2 weeks, we finish, write it all up, and we present it to Mr. Boyson. And the reason we were really scared is by the third decimal place, our calculation differed from what was in the books. Okay. And we thought he was just going to, climb all over us. So we present our result, how we came up with the different. And he sat there and he nodded his head and he said, You know, I've told you now for a little over a year that sometimes naive observers can come up with some important discoveries. He said, so it's possible that you just found a mistake. And
Wow.
we're going, oh my God, we might have corrected Sir Isaac Newton. And what he said was, and remember though, I also told you that science works on replication.
Yeah.
That's how you build confidence in. So he said, I'll tell you what, over the next week and a half, I want you to redo the study.
Yeah.
Do it from scratch a second time. Meanwhile, I'll make a few phone calls. I know a physics professor at Columbia. I'll
Wow.
make an appointment with him and we'll go into the city and present him with your results from both studies and see what he says. I know another physicist at Brookhaven National Labs, which was in the next town over. He said, I'll call him and do the same thing with him. He said, and then let's see. He said, but you have to replicate. So we dove into this thing. I mean, you know, we were real nerds. Four
Yeah.
of us went to MIT. One went to Princeton. One went to Berkeley. I mean, you know, real
Wow.
nerds. So we are diving into this thing. We do all the studies. We do everything really carefully. We come up with the results. At the end of the 2 weeks, we present to Mr. Boyson. We must have done something wrong the first time because we came up with the same number that's in the textbooks.
Wow. Wow.
And he said, okay, so now you learned the importance of replication. But think about this. What he
Yeah.
did was sparked our excitement and our curiosity in a way that no assignment could have done in a high school
Yeah.
physics class. I mean, I got to say, it was to this day, I see that as, I mean, I was always curious about how things worked. I was always taking things apart, sadly, not putting them back together again completely. Um, but I would say that was a turning point in which I really became a scientist. Um,
Wow.
and that was Max Boyson. Boy,
What a lovely story. And even this idea of you and the other students painting the room, preparing it, it just shows such, an ideal environment for learning to take
yeah,
place.
yeah.
That's amazing. Richard, just to wrap up, I've one thing that's been in my mind for a little while is I was started off as a waiter as well. I was a waiter in a restaurant till I was 25, and that just kind of resonated with me. And the other thing about this conversation we've had is it's been so life-giving and enriching. And I'm glad that people watching will have seen what it is I was talking about, which is your way of being as well, Richard. And in addition to the huge contribution you've made, just the way you do that and the kind of educator you are is incredibly inspiring for me and others. And honestly, I'm going to treasure this recording, this conversation. Apart from making it available for other educators, this has just been a wonderful conversation for me, Richard. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this conversation.
Thank you.
So with that, I think I'll bring this to a close. Thank you so much for your enthusiasm. And honestly, we're going to take so much from this conversation. And I really appreciate you and everything that you're doing.